Hello, today we're going to look at how to unpack a design brief. Now, this is a generic process that you can take to any brief that you want to. We're going to use an example that it's a fairly simple brief, but they can be used for any type of brief. Let's jump in. So firstly, what is unpacking a brief? Well, it's the process of breaking down the brief to its component parts. It allows us to see what is not obvious from the initial reading of the brief. It also helps us to fully understand the problem. If you remember from our previous video, as a designer, we focus on the problem. That makes the answer very simple, as opposed to focusing on the answer, which means we're just guessing at the problem. So why do we unpack a brief? Well, it allows us to see where innovation could occur and to see things that other people can't. It allows us to fully understand the brief and fully get to grips with the requirements of the brief. And lastly, it helps us really understand the client and their needs. So let's jump into it with an example. Here is a design brief. Design a range of garments for a student to wear to a festival. Your range must be sustainable, functional, and wearable. When we look at that, it's fairly straightforward, and I think that's a very simple brief. But using the process of unpacking, we're going to break it down to its component parts to see where all the gaps are, and there's lots. So we break down our brief by using 4 key areas. Here we go. Ready? Wow. Okay, so lots of connected things there, but we have 4 main areas. We have scope for creativity, we have definitions, we have specifications, and we have parameters. Now I'll go through those individually. The first one for any brief that we look at is specifications. Now these are the things that the brief specifically requires that are hard rules. So for this brief, we have to have a range. It says that specifically. It has to be for a student. It says that specifically. It has to be for a festival. It has to be sustainable, functional, and wearable. Now, usually for specifications, there'd be, say, a budget, but there'd also be a time frame. Now, these are hard and fast rules. For example, we can't submit work that isn't a range because that would not meet the brief. Now, parameters are a bit trickier. These are the boundaries of the brief, and we can push against them. You'll see a lot of overlap with parameters and specifications, but parameters allow us to kind of redefine these boundaries and create an amorphous brief, if you will. So let's take a look. So the first parameter for this brief is design. Now we get to define what kind of design and what kind of techniques we use. The next one is range. Now we have to have a range, but we get to define what kind of range that is. It says that it's for a student, but we get to define what kind of student it is. A primary school student, a university student, a further education student, a student of life. It says it has to be for a festival, but we can define what kind of festival. The clothes you wear to a maths festival are different to the ones you wear to a music festival. It says it has to be sustainable, functional, and wearable. Now, again, these are boundaries. What does functional mean? What does wearable mean? And what does sustainable mean in the context of this brief? Now, we also get to define this parameter here. It has to be a garment. But what is a garment? Is a swimsuit a garment? Is a wedding dress a garment? Is a suit of armor a garment? Probably yes to all 3 of those. And the last one, which is something that we often don't talk about. Now, most briefs will give you a time frame, for example, 8 weeks. Now, the parameter of that brief is 8 weeks, but we get to push against that how we use our time. Do we do 1 day a week for 8 weeks? Do we do 5 days a week for 8 weeks? Do we spend 1 day a week asking questions, 1 day a week making samples, 1 day a week testing things? Now, how we use our time is one of the parameters of any brief. The next up on our list is scope for creativity. And that is areas of the brief that we can be creative and push innovation. Now, for this particular brief, it is this. How we design, what techniques we might use, how we define a range. For example, could it be a range of single garments? So for example, a swimmer range, a range of swimwear, or could it be a range of camping clothes, which case you might have swimsuit, you might have something warm, you might have something waterproof. How we define a garment. Is a caftan a garment? Probably. Is a pair of shorts a garment? Definitely. Is some kind of costume body sculpture a garment? Well, in a festival, maybe, yes. How do we define function? So what is function for this brief? There's areas where we can be creative there. So jumping in a mosh pit, that's one function. Sleeping in a tent, that's another function. Now, the whole point of unpacking the brief is that we raise these questions. Sustainable. What is sustainable? Is it something that we can bury in the ground, in the mud at the end of the festival and flowers grow? Is it something we take back year after year after year and it becomes more worn in and more comfortable every time we wear it? What is wearable? Does it have to stay on your body for the whole time? Do you wear it to a mosh pit, dance around and have a good time, then take it off and sleep inside it like a tent? And lastly, this one's the tricky one. This one's the kind of big one, really. It's definitions. So it's concepts, words, or phrases we need to define to fully understand the brief. You see this kind of process of pulling information out of the brief and finding all these gaps. We found heaps of gaps already just with this small brief. So how do we define design in the context of this brief? Is it something that comes from an initial idea, or do we take an existing garment and alter it? How do we define range in the context of this brief? Is it a group of things? Is it a group of ideas? Is it a group of products? Is it a group of garments? How do we define a student? What is a student in the context of this brief? A person who attends an educational institution? A person who's learning things? What is a festival in the context of this brief? Now, there's all different kinds of festivals in the world, so we need to define what that is for us. What does sustainable mean for this brief? How do we define function for the purposes of this brief? What is wearable? How do we define a garment? Lots of things to think about. Okay, gang, thank you so much, and thank you for watching. Please tune in for our next episode.